Hey everyone, welcome to our deep dive on oligarchy in the United States.
Oligarchy.
You bet. Now you've given us a ton of interesting sources to work with, and it's clear you really want to get to the bottom of,
Yeah.
how much power is actually in the hands of a select few.
Right.
So when we talk about oligarchy, we're talking about the idea that a small elite group, often defined by wealth or influence,
Mm-hmm.
they are the ones really calling the shots in government.
Yeah.
But what's really fascinating to me is how this concept has played out
Mm-hmm.
throughout U.S. history.
Right.
I mean, we're going to uncover some pretty surprising examples
Yeah.
from the robber barons of the Gilded Age to
Right.
what we see today in Washington,
Mm-hmm.
that whole revolving door of influence thing.
Yeah, it's interesting because on the surface, the U.S. was built on these democratic ideals,
Right.
but looking closer, we see those ideals were often in tension with the reality of how power structures actually worked.
So even in those early days, the seeds of oligarchy
Mm-hmm.
were already there.
I think so.
It's kind of unsettling, right?
Yeah.
What did those early structures actually look like, and how did they shape the way power has been distributed in the U.S.?
If you think about the South,
Okay.
you had the landed gentry,
Right?
the wealthy landowners
Right.
with a ton of political power.
Mm-hmm.
And they made sure that power stayed in their hands.
Right.
I mean, voting rights.
Okay.
They were tied to property ownership,
Right.
which basically shut out a huge chunk of the population from having a say in government.
It's almost like the system was designed to favor those who already had the wealth and influence.
I
Right.
think so.
And was the North any different?
Not really. I mean, up north,
Okay.
you had the merchant elite
Okay.
who controlled trade and finance, right?
Right.
So they used that economic muscle to influence political leaders.
Mm-hmm.
And even the founding fathers,
Yeah.
those champions of democracy,
Right.
they weren't totally on board with the idea of pure democracy either.
Yeah. Right. They were worried about the tyranny of the majority.
Okay.
Right? That the masses might make rash decisions.
That was a big concern for them. So they set up systems
Right.
like the Electoral College
Right.
and the way senators were originally chosen.
Yeah.
That, you could argue, gave more weight to the elite.
Mm-hmm.
And they acted as a check on,
Okay. Yeah.
public opinion,
Okay.
the potential for things to get too volatile.
It makes you wonder if some of the power imbalances we see today are actually rooted in those early systems.
It's definitely something to think about.
Yeah, definitely food for thought. But let's shift gears for a second
Okay.
and fast forward to the late 19th century, the
Right.
Gilded Age,
Yeah,
a time of immense economic growth and innovation,
for sure.
but also a time when some truly massive fortunes were made,
Yeah.
often through,
Mm-hmm.
well, let's just say,
Yeah.
not always the most ethical business practices.
The Gilded Age is like a textbook example of how quickly oligarchic power can grab hold,
Okay.
especially during times of rapid economic change.
Yeah.
Think about someone like John D. Rockefeller
Rockefeller. Okay.
and his Standard Oil Company.
Right.
They used every trick in the book,
Okay.
from predatory pricing to backroom deals with railroads, to just crush their competition
Yeah.
and build a near monopoly.
Rockefeller's story is fascinating, right?
Yeah,
I mean, he starts as a bookkeeper,
right.
and through, ambition and ruthlessness,
Mm-hmm.
he becomes one of the richest men in history.
Yeah,
It's almost like a caricature of the American dream, right?
he really is.
Both the promise and the potential for excess.
The whole package.
But it wasn't just about the money for these guys, right?
No, I mean, Rockefeller and others like him,
Yeah.
they knew how important political influence was.
Right.
They spent a ton of money trying to win over politicians
Mm-hmm.
and get laws passed that would benefit them.
Didn't Ida Tarbell's expose on Standard Oil play a big role
Huge.
in its eventual breakup by the Supreme Court?
Absolutely. I mean, Tarbell's reporting was meticulous.
Right.
It exposed all the shady stuff Standard Oil was doing,
Yeah.
which really got the public riled up
Mm-hmm.
and led to that landmark antitrust case
Okay.
that broke the company's grip on the oil industry.
It shows you that even against these giants,
Right,
investigative journalism can really hold the powerful accountable.
for sure.
But Standard Oil wasn't the only example of concentrated wealth corrupting politics back then.
No.
I mean, we had the Tweed Ring and Tammany Hall
Right.
ruling New York City for decades.
Yeah, Tammany Hall is a classic case of how a small group can just exploit their power to get rich, often at the expense of the very people they're supposed to represent.
Yeah.
I mean, widespread voter fraud,
Wow.
rigged elections. They used their control over city contracts to line their own pockets.
It's like something out of a gangster movie, right?
Yes, it really is.
The level of corruption is incredible.
And again, it was investigative journalism and satire that helped bring them down.
Right.
Thomas Nast, the political cartoonist, he just relentlessly mocked Boss Tweed and his buddies.
In his drawings.
Yeah, they were everywhere.
Right.
Really turned public opinion against them.
Those cartoons had a real impact, huh?
They did.
It's amazing how powerful an image can be. Looking back at the Gilded Age, it's hard not to see parallels to today.
I agree.
Concentrated wealth.
Yeah.
The influence of money in politics.
Right.
There's still major issues.
Huge.
What can we learn from these historical examples?
That's a great question.
How do they inform our understanding of the challenges to democracy that we face in the 21st century?
Well, that's something we're going to explore further as we go.
Okay.
We'll see how those early patterns of power and influence really laid the groundwork for some of the most pressing issues we face today.
Okay, I'm ready for more.
Let's do it. You know, when we talk about the Gilded Age and all that power, it's hard to ignore the parallels to today.
Right.
Especially when it comes to the influence of money in politics.
Yeah, it feels like we've come full circle in a way.
I agree.
Back then, it was the robber barons pulling the strings. Now it's corporations and wealthy donors shaping the political landscape.
And a big turning point in all this was Citizens United.
Oh, yeah. Citizens United.
That 2010 Supreme Court decision.
It seems like every conversation about money and politics ends up right back at Citizens United.
It was a game changer.
What was it about that ruling that was so significant?
Well, before Citizens United, there were limits on how much corporations and unions could spend on elections.
Right.
The idea was to prevent them from having too much influence.
Makes sense.
But the Supreme Court basically tossed those limits out.
Really?
They said corporate spending on political campaigns, it's a form of free speech protected by the First Amendment.
So corporations got the same rights as individuals when it came to
pretty much
political spending.
It was a controversial decision.
I bet.
Critics say it gave corporations and wealthy special interests way too much power.
Right.
Drowning out the voices of everyday citizens.
And it wasn't just corporations, right?
No, dark money groups also became a major force after Citizens United.
Dark money?
Yeah, that's political spending where you don't know where the money's coming from.
Oh, okay.
These groups don't have to disclose their donors.
So it's impossible to track.
Pretty much.
And that raises some serious concerns about accountability.
Definitely.
And the potential for corruption.
For sure.
So after Citizens United, we have this system where the wealthy, they can just bankroll entire campaigns.
Right.
Influence policy from the shadows.
Without anyone knowing who they are.
Wow. And are there any examples of this happening?
Take the Koch brothers network.
The Koch brothers, okay. Charles and David Koch.
Billionaires inherited their wealth from oil and gas.
Okay.
They built this enormous network of political organizations.
Wow.
Pouring millions into elections. Pushing for policies that aligned with their libertarian views.
The Koch brothers are like a textbook example of big money in politics.
They basically created their own political ecosystem.
And they were successful.
Oh, yeah. Very effective at using their wealth to shape the political landscape.
How so?
Supporting candidates, funding think tanks, mobilizing voters.
Around what issues?
Things like deregulation, tax cuts.
Okay.
They were especially active in fighting climate change science.
Wow. So it's like a case study in turning wealth into political power.
Pretty much.
But it's not just elections, right?
Right.
There's lobbying, too.
Absolutely. Lobbying is all about trying to persuade lawmakers to support or oppose certain laws.
And corporations are good at it.
They've got it down to a science.
How does it work?
They hire these teams of experienced lobbyists, often former government officials.
So they know the system.
Inside and out.
Right.
They wine and dine lawmakers, make campaign contributions, give expert testimony.
It's like a constant tug of war.
Yeah.
With corporations pulling policy in their favor.
And some industries are better at it than others. The pharmaceutical industry. They spend a fortune lobbying every year.
And what have they achieved?
They've influenced laws on drug pricing, patent protections, regulations.
Wow.
All things that affect the cost of healthcare.
Right. And access to medicine.
Exactly.
It's a reminder that money in politics, it has real-world consequences.
Absolutely.
And the opioid crisis.
Yeah.
It's a tragic example of how corporate greed and lack of regulation
For sure.
can have devastating effects.
The opioid crisis is a prime example of putting corporate interests ahead of public health.
Right.
Companies like Purdue Pharma,
Okay.
they aggressively marketed these highly addictive painkillers,
Like
OxyContin, for example, but they downplayed the risks. They lobbied against regulations that would limit opioid prescriptions.
it's hard to believe a company would put profits over people like that.
It's a dark chapter, for sure.
Purdue Pharma did eventually plead guilty,
Right.
paid billions in settlements.
As the damage was already done.
Right. Millions addicted.
Countless lives lost.
It shows the need for balance
Mm-hmm.
between corporate rights and the government's duty to protect its citizens.
Absolutely.
So what can we do about all this?
That's the million-dollar question.
Are there any solutions to curb the influence of money in politics?
It's a tough one.
Right.
Campaign finance reform is an uphill battle.
Yeah.
Powerful forces benefit from the status quo.
But there are people fighting for change, right?
Oh, yeah. There are organizations and individuals working hard.
Okay, what are they doing?
Pushing for stricter campaign finance laws, more transparency in political spending, limits on lobbying.
It's good to know people are working on this. But it's clear the influence of money in politics is deeply rooted.
It's going to take a lot of work to change things.
Okay, so we've talked about money in politics.
Mm-hmm.
What about that revolving door between government and industry?
Ah, the revolving door.
It's that constant flow of people
Right.
moving between government jobs and the private sector.
Often in the same industries they were regulating.
Yeah, that's the problem, right?
Exactly.
It raises concerns about conflicts of interest, erodes public trust,
For sure.
and the potential for personal gain.
It's like if they're regulating their future employers
Right.
or cashing in on their government experience.
It makes you wonder whose interests they're really serving.
And we've got some great examples from our source material.
Okay, let's
Dick
study.
Cheney, for instance.
Cheney, okay.
He was CEO of Halliburton before becoming vice president.
Halliburton, the oil services company?
That's the one.
The one involved in the Iraq War.
Yes, and during Cheney's time in office, Halliburton got billions in government contracts related to the war.
Really?
Some awarded without competitive bidding.
That's suspicious.
It definitely raises eyebrows.
It looks like Cheney's former company benefited from his position.
Even if nothing illegal happened,
The optics aren't good.
it erodes public trust.
When it looks like personal connections are influencing decisions.
Absolutely.
Do we have any other examples?
There's also Tom Wheeler.
Okay.
He was appointed chairman of the FCC by Obama.
Okay, FCC, yeah.
And before that,
Yeah.
he was a lobbyist for the cable and wireless industry,
So he was put in charge of regulating?
the very industry he used to represent.
Wow, I bet that was controversial.
It was. People were worried about his ties to telecom,
Right.
especially when it came to net neutrality.
Net neutrality, that was a big issue.
Huge.
It's the principle that internet providers,
Right.
they should treat all internet traffic equally.
No favoring certain websites or services.
Right. It's essential for a free and open internet.
But the telecom companies weren't happy about it.
And they pressured Wheeler.
To side with them.
What happened?
Well, he faced a lot of pushback. The public, even Obama. He ended up supporting strong net neutrality rules.
Wow, that's surprising.
It shows that public pressure can sometimes work.
Right, but those rules were later rolled back
They were.
under Trump.
Right.
It's that tug of war again.
Between corporate interests and the public good.
Exactly. So these examples really highlight the challenges
Mm-hmm.
of keeping the revolving door in check
It's tough.
and making sure those in power are serving the public.
We need more transparency from our elected officials.
Agreed. Speaking of manipulating the system,
Oh, yeah.
let's talk about gerrymandering.
Gerrymandering, the art of drawing electoral district boundaries
Okay.
to favor a particular party.
It's like rigging elections, right?
Exactly.
How does it work? Who gets to draw these lines?
In most states, it's the state legislatures.
So if one party controls the legislature, they control the district lines.
That's the problem.
That's ripe for abuse.
It creates opportunities for partisan advantage.
Right. The party in power can draw the lines
Right.
to create safe seats for their candidates,
Exactly.
making it impossible for the other party to win.
They're choosing their voters.
Instead of the voters choosing them.
Exactly.
How do they do it?
They can pack voters from the opposing party
Right.
into a few districts,
Right.
making those districts heavily in their favor
Okay.
while spreading their own voters out.
So they win those areas.
Yeah.
It's like a sophisticated way to rig the system.
It is, and it has serious consequences.
Like what?
Less competition,
Okay.
Politicians who aren't accountable to their voters,
Right.
entire communities can be disenfranchised,
I remember those cases in North Carolina and Pennsylvania
right?
where the courts had to step in.
The gerrymandering was so blatant.
It's a widespread problem, huh?
It undermines representative government.
When politicians choose their voters.
It goes against the whole idea.
Are there any solutions to gerrymandering?
There's a movement to create independent redistricting commissions
Okay.
to take the power away from partisan legislatures.
And some states have done this.
They have, and there's growing support for it nationally.
That's good news.
We need to be aware of these tactics
Right.
and push for fair representation
Yeah.
and a level playing field in our elections.
We've covered a lot.
We have.
Money on politics, the revolving door, gerrymandering.
It's a lot to take in.
It paints a pretty bleak picture
Yeah.
of how power can be used to undermine democracy.
But recognizing the problems is the first step.
Right. Knowledge is power.
Exactly.
By understanding these issues,
Yeah.
we can become more informed and engaged citizens.
And hold those in power accountable.
It's crazy, right?
Yeah.
How all these different things,
Mhm.
from Rockefeller's oil empire
Right.
to campaign finance,
Mhm.
it all connects to this bigger story
Yeah.
about power dynamics in America.
Oligarchy, it's not always this in-your-face tyrannical thing.
Right.
It's often more subtle,
Okay.
working through these systems and structures
Yeah.
that over time
Mm-hmm.
have tilted the playing field.
In favor of the wealthy and connected.
Exactly.
It's easy to feel overwhelmed by it all,
Right.
like the system's rigged.
Yeah.
But then we see those moments where everyday people,
Right.
journalists, activists,
Yeah.
they push back against those in power and make real change happen.
Those moments are so important, not just for the victories themselves, but for the message they send.
What message?
That power ultimately belongs to the people.
Right.
And even the most powerful systems
Yeah.
can be challenged
And change.
when people demand better.
So we're not just passive bystanders in all this?
No, we have agency.
Okay.
We have a voice, a responsibility to use them.
And that starts with understanding how these systems work, right?
Absolutely.
Recognizing the patterns
Yeah.
and knowing when to leverage our collective power.
To make a difference.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive,
Yeah.
I'm curious,
Okay.
what's your take on the state of oligarchy in the U.S. today?
That's a tough one.
Is it everywhere?
It's definitely a question people have been debating for ages.
Right.
The influence of wealth and power is real,
Yeah.
and there are definitely forces working to concentrate that power even more.
Okay.
But I also believe in the power of democracy
Okay.
and the ability of people to challenge those who would undermine it.
It's a balancing act then.
I think so.
Recognizing the threats to democracy.
Right.
While also believing that things can get better.
Exactly. And that hope isn't naive.
Okay.
We've seen throughout history that progress is possible,
Even against the odds.
even when it seems impossible.
But it takes work.
Vigilance,
Mm-hmm.
engagement,
Okay.
and holding those in power accountable.
It's a call to action for all of us, right?
It is.
To stay informed.
Yes.
Participate in the political process.
Uh-huh.
Support organizations working for a better society.
Absolutely. The future of our democracy depends on it.
Well said. I think we've given